In Revelation 13. And Revelation 13 really is one of the most important passages in the Bible for understanding idolatry and political thought. But since it's written in symbols, it's not usually understood very well, and we're trying to unpack it. The gist of what's here has always been understood. You've got a political power, you've got a church power, they conspire together against the saints. That much anybody gets out of this, but we can do more, and that's what we're trying to do. So we're looking from verse 11 to the end at the land beast or false prophet. And we read in verse 11, I saw another beast coming up out of the land, and he had 2 horns like a lamb, which now reminds us of Jesus, who is the lamb, who has 7 horns. So this is a counterfeit Christ. The sea beast is a counterfeit father, and the land beast is a counterfeit Christ. He speaks like a dragon. The dragon is a counterfeit God, and just as Jesus spoke as God, being God incarnate, so the counterfeit Christ, the land beast, speaks like a dragon. He exercises all the authority of the first beast in his presence. Just as Jesus exercised all the authority of God the Father in his presence, I only do the things that my Father gives me to do. The Father sends the Spirit to be with Jesus all the time. So the sea beast is always present in a way with the land beast, and the land beast is working to call attention to the sea beast. And we saw the Herods bring Palestine under the Romans repeatedly, and that's the main immediate historical application. Verse 12 continuing, he makes the land and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast whose fatal wound was healed. So the work of the Herods is to bring the Jews in submission to Rome. The work of the false Christ is to get people to worship the false father, just as the work of Jesus is to bring us to worship the true Father. Moreover, verse 12, it's primarily the fact that the sea beast has died and come to life again that brings about this worship. It says, to worship the first beast whose fatal wound was healed. It doesn't just say to worship the sea beast or first beast. It says to worship the first beast whose fatal wound was healed. Just as Jesus is worshipped by us now because he died and came to life again. He was worshipped before as the angel of the Lord, but now our worship of him is qualified by his death and resurrection. So the worship that's claimed by the beast is qualified by his death and resurrection, and this is a counterfeit, then, of the gospel. This entire system is a counterfeit not just of religion, but specifically a counterfeit of New Covenant religion. Now, there are counterfeits of Old Testament religion that exist, but we're looking here at a counterfeit of New Testament religion, because the counterfeit involves this death and resurrection motif, which wasn't there in the Old Testament counterfeits. So that's part of what's going on here, and that's why there's a big implication of the Judaizers here. Now we come to verse 13, and we'll continue on with this, and as we build week by week, I hope that eventually we'll have a good picture of what's going on here. Let me just read the whole section again, verses 11 and following. John says, I saw another beast coming up out of the land. He had 2 horns like a lamb. He spoke like a dragon. He exercises all the authority of the first beast, the sea beast, in his presence. He makes the land and those who dwell in her to worship the first beast whose fatal wound was healed. And he performs great signs or miracles, so that he even makes fire come down out of heaven to the land in the presence of men. A false Elijah, false Pentecost motif there. He deceives those who dwell on the land because of the signs it was given him to perform in the presence of the beast, telling those who dwell on the land to make an image of the beast who had the wound of the sword and has come to life. And there was given to him to give breath to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast might even speak, and cause as many as do not worship the image of the beast to be killed. And he, that is the land beast, causes all, small and great, rich and poor, freemen and slaves, to be given a mark on their right hand or on their forehead, and that no one should be able to buy or sell except the one who has the mark, either the name of the beast or the number of his name. Here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate or assess the number of the sea beast, for the number is that of mankind. The number is 666. We're a long way from there, but we will get there. Verse 13, he says, he performs great signs, so that he even makes fire come out of heaven to the land in the presence of men. And parallel to that, under the sea beast, is what we have in verse 5. There was given to him a great mouth, speaking great things and blasphemies. So we've got great signs with the land beast, a great mouth speaking great things and blasphemies with the sea beast. Now, what kinds of things are here? Well, in the first place, remember that the land beast is a counterfeit of the two witnesses. The two witnesses are the prophets, Moses and Elijah. The land beast has two horns. They're his Moses and Elijah horn. And as the two prophets call down fire from heaven, so the land beast calls down fire from heaven. And as the two prophets have a Moses power to bring about plagues, so the land beast has a Moses power to set up a false temple, image of the beast. So the false prophet corresponds to the two witnesses. The two horns of the false prophet or land beast correspond to the two witnesses. And here is a reference to his Elijah power. The Elijah power calls down fire from heaven and in the presence of men. Second of all, he's a false Christ, because Jesus sends down fire from heaven. And once again, the land beast is a counterfeit of the second person of the Trinity. The sea beast is the first person, the land beast is the second person, the beast image is the third person. And the land beast or false prophet calling down fire from heaven to the land in the presence of men makes it a false Pentecost. Now that's what we're going to spend some time exploring in a couple of minutes. One other thing I need to tell you is, it says here, he performs great signs so that he even makes fire come down out of heaven to the land in the presence of men. Just as the word earth or land in Revelation refers to Judaism, the word men or mankind in Revelation refers to Jews. Gentiles are not called by the word anthropos, which means man or mankind. They are called by the expression every nation and tribe and tongue and peoples, or every peoples and tongue and nation and tribe. It's different every time it shows up, but that is the expression that delineates the Gentiles, those who dwell in the oikumene. But in Revelation, the word man or mankind specifically has reference to those who dwell on the land. And that means the Jews. This will be important when we see that the number 666 is a Jewish number. But I don't know if you want me to take the time to make a technical study of this, but if you go through the book of Revelation with a concordance, you'll find that in the book, the land is Israel. Man or mankind, that word refers to those who dwell on the land. It refers to Jews. And Gentiles who dwell on the sea or on the islands of the sea, they are called peoples and nations and tribes and tongues. It's just a difference in language, but it's part of the way the book is written. That's not true in other books of the New Testament, but it is true here, and it's part of the logic of it. Ultimately, human beings are priests. All human beings are, because Adam was set up to be priest of the garden. And so the use of the word man or human being in Revelation refers to the priestly aspect of humanity, or, to put it another way, the use of man in Revelation refers to the priestly nation. And the non-priestly nations, the Gentiles, are called by these other names, peoples and nations and tribes and tongues. So, once again, you can see this. Fire comes down from heaven to the land in the presence of men. Fire comes down from heaven to Palestine in the presence of the Jews, or by application, fire comes down out of heaven to the church in the presence of believers, because this is a churchly function here. I mean, that's an application, but in this phase of history, we're looking at a false Pentecost. Now, how does a false Pentecost happen, and when did it happen, and what's being referred to here? Well, let's get the time set in our minds again. First of all, Rome collapses when Julius Caesar is killed. Then Rome is resurrected under Octavian Caesar, or Augustus Caesar, who sets up the Roman Empire. Now, this is the beast whose head was crushed and came back to life again. This is the beast that died and came to life again. And the Jews are all impressed by this, and this causes them to be much more enamored of Roman power than they were before. They are tempted by power religion. We spent last week on that. And when Rome loses her power in Palestine, it looks like the Jews are going to get free from the Romans, and then Rome puts her power back into Palestine, then, I forget when that would be, but when Rome puts her power back into Palestine, then, hey, who's like the beast? Michael, who is like God? Michachai, who is like the beast? They're amazed. He comes back to life again. The third thing that's relevant for our discussion is Nero goes cracker dog, or he goes nuts. That's in 64 A.D. Or better, A.D. 64. Actually, might as well speak correct English here. A.D. 64. You know that B.C. dates are 220 B.C., but A.D. dates are A.D. 64. That's because this is Latin. This happens, and that's already happened here. The beast is being corrupted. The dragon has corrupted the beast, and now we are told that throughout this entire history, the Romans have been setting up Herods and false prophets, but specifically we're being focused in on an event that happens after this. There is a false Pentecost that happens sometime after AD 64, but before the destruction of Jerusalem. Let's just say AD 65. The next thing that happens in the book of Revelation is the martyrdom of the 144,000. Let's put that in AD, say, 67. And then we have the destruction of Jerusalem, which is 67 to 70. That's the sequence of events. Once you understand this sequence of events, we're in a better position to begin to understand what the false Pentecost is. Now, we don't need the sequence of events to do that, but it helps. How does a false Pentecost come about? What is a false Pentecost? Because this is what revives Judaism. Well, there is a syndrome that happens in history, and some of us will live to see it happen again. There is a big crisis that comes in a civilization or among a people, and as a result of the crisis, there's more and more pressure on people. And as people are pressured and they grasp around for something to give meaning to their lives and something to give an explanation, they undergo conversions, mass conversions. And the conversion leads to fanaticism, and the fanaticism leads to murdering. You find somebody to blame, and you start killing them. Now, that doesn't happen in societies like ours because we're prosperous and we're doing okay. But if people were hungry and they were starving and their whole lives have been destroyed and you had lots and lots and lots and lots of people like that, you would see this come to pass. Now, let's unpack that. First of all, there is a crisis of culture accompanied by various distresses. That crisis might consist of a plague. It might consist of a war. It might consist of oppression. But it's a crisis. And people have to handle it. The second thing that happens, and this happens over and over in history, is that pressure builds up to a bursting point. Now let me give you an example of it. World War I was a crisis, especially for Germany, since the Germans lost. And there's always a question as to whether the right side won or lost. And when we look at World War I, just because we happen to come in on one side doesn't mean it was the right side. The European situation was so complicated that it's difficult to know or sort out whose fault it was, but it happened. It's much better to understand the world wars as a European civil war, a civil war within the European culture. It wasn't really a war between nations over boundaries. It was a civil war within a culture. That's a much more helpful way of understanding both of those world wars. And they're really one war with an interim in between. What was not settled in the first got settled in the second. But that aside, you have a tremendous crisis because the Germans are defeated and they're forced to pay a bunch of war reparations, and people are poor, poor, poor as a result. Poor and humiliated. They still think that they were not at fault. Now, after World War II, if you'd gone to a German on the street and says, was the war your fault? They'd have said, yeah, it was the Nazis' fault. You know, it's our fault. But World War I wasn't that way. They felt like they had been right, but they lost, and that's it. But now they were forced to pay a bunch of reparations by the Versailles Treaty. They lost land, they lost honor, and they were upset. That's a crisis. Now, the crisis continued during the Weimar Republic, when there was a massive inflation of paper money. And I used to collect stamps, and it was always fun to get those old German stamps from the early 30s. 600 billion mark stamp. You had 1 million mark and 2 million mark and 3 million mark stamps that had old Hindenburg on them. Then they would be overstamped. 200 billion, 300 billion, 400 billion. Because inflation was happening so fast, they couldn't even make new stamps. They just stamped over the top of them these new values until finally the nation was destroyed. And what happened? Pressure builds up. Or take another example. You're in Israel in the days of Jesus. The Romans have taken over. The Romans aren't all that bad, but it's no fun either. The Romans can compel you to go a mile with them. And as Jesus says, go 2 miles. Roman soldiers got all his gear, all his heavy gear, and he could just take somebody off the street and say, walk a mile with me on the way out of town. Now, we as soldiers were marching from Jericho to Caesarea, and they could grab anybody and say, carry my gear for 1 mile. Now, the Romans weren't allowed to do more than that, but they could do that. They were in charge. Jews didn't like that. They were under pressure. They had to pay taxes to Caesar and like it. But in a situation, there was more and more pressure. And you begin to have zealots bringing pressure on the situation. How'd they do that? Well, the zealots were like these Palestinian guerrilla fighters. They go out and hit and run a bunch of Romans. Here's a century of Roman soldiers. You know what a century of soldiers is? It's a group that's governed by a centurion. And it consists of how many men? 100. At least it's supposed to. So you've got a century of men out here on patrol, and they're going through some defile in Israel, and a whole bunch of zealots throw great big rocks down on them and kill a bunch of them. And then the zealots run away. What do the Romans do? Oh, they go to the neighboring town and beat up on all the people there, maybe kill some of them. How do you deal with terrorism? How was it dealt with in the Vietnam War? You hit them, you can't get the guerrillas back, so you go and you punish the countryside, and you say to the countryside, you turn in these guerrillas. So they go to the neighboring towns, and they kill every 10th man or something, and they say, we're going to do this again until you turn in those zealots. Because you know who they are. They're your sons, they're your uncles, they're out there in the woods, and you either turn them in, or we're going to punish you. It's kind of like the old principle, you know. You got one guy in the platoon who's messing up. You don't know who it is. You punish the whole platoon until they turn him in, right? So that's the impression. But the zealots, because they wouldn't submit to Rome, and Jesus always said, just submit and go along with this, because eventually it'll change. But the zealots wouldn't submit, so they were building up all kinds of trouble in Israel. And the Pharisees were outwardly submissive to Rome, but with their left hand they were financing the zealots. And pressure was building up to a bursting point. and it can't continue. Something has to give. And the third thing that happens in this type of historical situation, which is just what we're looking at here, is some type of Pentecost or epiphany occurs. People are converted back to the old ways. So you know what our problem is? All these new things have come in. These new people have come in. And we're going to go back to the old ways, and we're going to settle things. Now, what are the old ways? Well, the old ways is a myth. The old ways that people think that they're going to go back to never really existed. An example of that is the Jewish oral law tradition. If you had asked a Jew, what's the oral law? They would have said, oh, well, it's the old ways. The ways that were handed down to Moses on Mount Sinai. And they were forgotten for a long time, but we've gone back to the old ways. Really? No, they weren't old at all. They'd only been around for about a century. But the myth was these are the old ways. And people feel secure if they can go back to the old ways. You got trouble in a church, people want to go back to the old ways. Got trouble in the Christian Reformed Church today, what do people want? They want to go back and have 1955 type Christian Reformed churches. If we can only just get back to the way things were when we were little kids, everything would be okay. Now go back to the old ways and deal with these people who are constantly trying to change everything. We'll get rid of them, and we'll go back to the old ways. It's like people who think the gospel songs are the old songs. They're not very old. They're only about 100 years old. But that's a real mild example of people thinking something's old that's not. But the old ways is a myth. Yeah, when people think about going back to the old ways, there's some truth to it because they can look back in the past and see that these problems didn't exist and that things were a certain way. But the way they have reconstructed the old ways in their mind is false. And the old ways becomes a religion. Now, what happened in Germany after the Great Inflation? What was the old ways that everybody turned back to and said, this is what we need. We need to go back to the old ways, and that'll settle things. What was it? You know what it is, but I wonder if it'll click in your mind. Just remember your World War II and previous history. Germany, they've had the crisis of the war. They've had the increasing pressure of inflation. Everything is a disaster. And now Hitler comes and they vote Hitler in. But why? What's the myth? What's the old ways that caught everybody's attention?
Blaming the Jews.
Blaming the Jews. That's great. That is half of it. There's an even bigger old way that's behind blaming the Jews. The Aryan race. We're the ancient Aryan race. Blonde-haired and blue-eyed. We're the original one. We're the ones who developed Indo-European languages. There's no such thing as Indo-European languages, but they believe there was because they were anti-Semitic. All languages go back to Hebrew. You scratch down underneath Greek and Roman, Latin roots or any other language in the world, you find Hebrew roots. I have a whole dictionary that shows the Hebrew roots behind English words. And that's because Hebrew was the language before the Tower of Babel. But they didn't believe that. They want to believe that there was a separate Indo-European language and that German is the best preservation of it. And the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Aryan race is the superior race. And that's the old traditional ways. And in the old days, we didn't allow all these swarthy, dark-haired, Jewish, big-nosed type people coming into our culture. In the old days, Christianity was linked up with the state in such a way that the state controlled the church. Now, they could look back at Luther and some of the things Luther wrote about the Jews, and they could get a lot of ammo for this. And they could look at a lot of things in their tradition. But the old ways was really a myth. The myth of Aryan supremacy, the myth of that all European culture came out of Germanic peoples, the myth that the Jews were the problem. But the real conversion back to the old ways comes here. Now, what's described here in the book of Revelation is the same thing. You have this pressure building up in Israel, and all of a sudden there's a snap. And people say, you know what our problem is? We have departed from the old ways. You know what we need to do? We need to go back to the oral law tradition. And you know what the problem is? The problem is these Christians who've been attacking the oral law tradition. We're going to go back and we're going to have it now in full force. So the fourth phase is fanaticism. It was because we forgot the old ways that things have gone bad. Everybody's excited. Everybody's being converted. You have mass meetings. There are crusades, gospel crusades for the return to the old ways. There's all kinds of enthusiasm. Everybody's happy. Now describe for me how that happened in Germany after people were converted to the old ways. What do you think of when you think of Nazi Germany before the war? Pardon? All the parades, the mass meetings. People love being part of things like that. If you haven't ever been, and I think most of us have never really been part of something like that in a big way, it's very hard to imagine. I've talked to men who've gone to Promise Keepers meetings, and they say, you know, when you get 10,000 men together in an auditorium and they're all singing together, there's something that happens to you. Well, that's right. God is 3 in 1, and when you get together with a whole bunch of other people and you are one with them, there's something that happens. It can be good or it can be bad. And if it's bad, it's really bad. That's called mob psychology, and it's real. And when you get all these people together, all wearing the same uniform, all marching together, all doing this, that, and the other, and there are all these lights and these banners here and there's music everywhere, it's something. If you've ever seen the film The Triumph of the Will, it's amazing to watch. It's worth watching just to see an example of a choreographed, artistically, very highly artistic mass meeting that is an example of this. To reinforce the old ways and to seal everybody into being part of this new movement. And anybody that's not part of the movement then becomes the enemy. What part did music play in Germany? Music always plays a part because when people mass together, they sing. They either sing in marching or they sing whatever. But yeah, see, Wagner, they did go to concerts, and I don't remember how much of it there was, but Wagner was championed by the Nazis for a very particular reason. You know what it was? He was one of the big architects of going back to the old way myth. He was extremely anti-Jewish, for one thing. But Wagner wrote all these operas that were basically attempts to re-mythologize. He took the Twilight of the Gods, which was just the Nibelungenlied, which is the German national epic. He re-mythologized that in 4 huge operas, the Tristan myth and Tristan and Isolde. All the traditional legends and the Parzival myth, he reconstructed Christianity along the lines of what they would think of as traditional Aryan religion. So what he did was he took the 19th century Romanticism, blended it with German tradition, and said, this is the old ways. So Wagner was very much an apostle of the old ways. The new old ways in quotation marks. And so all of his operas and his philosophy was very much behind it. And it fits right in there. Uh-huh.
I read one where some of the Nazis, they would go out and kill people, and then they would go to one of those
rallies,
and they would walk there and actually shed tears of the music.
Yeah.
Yes, they would go out and kill them.
Well, yes, because when you become a fanatic, you can go out and you can kill people, and then you can go 5 minutes later and weep over an opera. It's hard for us to imagine because we live kind of moderate lives. But if we got stuck in a crisis like that, our emotional swings would become real wide too. Like what you see in the Psalms. The Psalms were written in crisis situation. People are trying to kill David. He's been on the run for months. He's absolutely exhausted. He's at the end of his rope. And the Psalms show these tremendous mood swings, don't they? Sometimes the Psalms are hard to read because you'll be reading one verse and the next verse doesn't seem to have anything to do with it. It's because a lot of it is crisis literature. We don't live there, so it's harder for us to imagine. The Psalms show us the true way to deal with crisis. If you don't deal with it by coming before the true God and resting in Him, or forcing yourself to get under Him in such a way that you rest in Him, then you're going to wind up doing something like we're looking at here. So after the big conversion, after the Pentecost where everybody says, aha! And they speak with new tongues and everybody's excited and everybody's talking to everybody else. Then what happens is we get fanaticism, crusades, and all this stuff. And that happened in Israel at this time. Sometime in the 60s, 65 or so, all of a sudden the pressure was so much that the Jews said, we need to go back to the old ways. And everybody became excited. And everybody became enthusiastic. And you know what they said? They said, we're going to throw off the Roman yoke. God is with us. The proof of it is that everybody is excited. The Spirit is moving in our midst. And we can throw the Romans off. And so they rebelled against Rome, and Rome came in and smushed them. Kind of dangerous to have a false Pentecost. But all of a sudden, when this happened, they became extremely enthusiastic, and they decided they were going to throw off the Romans. And of course, if anybody didn't go along with this, why, they were spoiling the fun. And much worse than spoiling the fun, they might destroy everything. You don't see the need to go back to the old ways? You stand against us in this? We're going to fight Rome? And you refuse to go along? Are you a traitor? Are you going to turn us into Rome? And besides, whose fault is all this? How did we get into this mess in the first place? Who was it that told us to forget the old ways? Who was it who came along with new ways? Well, who was it? The Christians, the apostles. They're the ones who came along with the new ways and said, forget the old ways. They said the new covenant has supplanted the old covenant, and even worse, they said the whole oral law tradition was demonic. They fought against the old ways. They said Jesus was going to tear down the temple. Now you have this big religious revival, and who are we going to blame? We're going to blame those who refuse to join in the marches. We're going to blame the Christians. We're going to put them to death because it's their fault. And it feels good to hit back. Now, in Nazism, whose fault was it? Well, it was the Jews. The Jews are not of our race. And, of course, Germans have disliked the Jews for a long time, for centuries. But especially during the Weimar inflation period, the Jewish hatred came to be real intense. Why? Do you know why? We talked about all that paper money inflation, and it was during that period and right after that the real hatred of the Jews took off big time in Germany. Why? The Jews knew that paper money was no good, and so they bought gold and silver and precious things. They had a whole history of knowing it. Of course, Jews are bankers and they're smart. They know about money. They're all sons of Jacob. But on top of that, here are all these Germans. All of their statues and their paintings and their nice houses and their villas are being bought up by Jews because the Jews had put their wealth in gold and silver and precious stones. And the Germans had their wealth in paper money, and it was now worthless. You got 20,000 marks saved up in the bank for your retirement, and now a loaf of bread costs 200 million marks. Your savings are worth nothing. So how are you going to eat? How are you going to live? Well, you're going to have to sell off your villa. Well, who's got the money? The people who have the gold and the silver. Jews. So there was a lot of other reasons to hate the Jews, because the Jews had been provident when the Germans had not been. But on top of that, of course, they'd rejected this revival of the old ways, and they refused to join the marches. And of course, it wasn't just Jews. It was primarily Jews, but there's also gypsies, Catholics, and evangelicals. And we tend to forget that any of the evangelical churches who spoke out and said what's going on here is wrong, they were also persecuted, and they wound up in concentration camps, as did Catholics, who, of course, would not go along with this because their loyalty was to the Pope, not to Hitler. But you have a scapegoat. Now let's take another example of something that's going on right now in our world. This syndrome here should explain some things to you. In a certain part of the world, there has been a crisis that's been going on for a long time. There are people who were dispossessed from their land, And they have friends in a lot of other places. And pressure has been building up throughout this entire world. And this is about a third of the entire world that's been undergoing this pressure. And these people have more and more felt that their old ways are being compromised. And new ways are coming into this 1/3 of the world. And now there has been an epiphany, a Pentecost, and there is a fanatical movement in this 1/3 of the world to go back to the old ways and to kick out those who brought in the new ways, and particularly to punish the people who've been causing trouble. What am I talking about? Yeah, I'm talking about Islamic fundamentalism. That's what Islamic fundamentalism is. That's why there is this movement now. It's a big mass movement all over this part of the world. And the new ways is just Western science and Western capitalism has come in. And all of a sudden their women aren't dressing under the veil and under the purdah anymore. And all of a sudden their women are going off to college. And all of a sudden people are becoming Christians. You realize that you can be put to death for becoming a Christian in these countries. And there have been cases of that recently. And so now we have a Pentecost. There has been a Pentecost in the Islamic world, a false Pentecost. Everybody's excited. Everybody's on the march. The mullahs have got everybody riled up. And they feel good. They feel excited. Now they understand. The people who've caused all this problem, now we can deal with them. It's them. Who is the them? Well, it's all the traitors in Islam who've gone for these new Western ways. Plus their running dog associates, the Jews, in Palestine. And it's hard to deal with 1 million people on the march who are all enthusiastic. These things happen in history. Now, it's fun to hit back. If somebody just hits you once, you may not hit back. But if you have lived with this pressure and crisis for 30 or 40 years, or maybe your whole life, and you finally get a chance to hit back, it's fun to hit back. And that's why when the crisis comes and the revival comes and people are enthusiastic, they want to find somebody to blame. And there's always somebody to blame because there's always some group of people who won't go along with the revival. Let's say that we had a big revival in America of turning back to the old ways, to the founders of the Constitution. But what really was going on was a bunch of new ideas were being promoted under the guise of going back to the founders. And what would happen if, a bunch of Christians like us said, going back to the founders is not the answer. Christ is the answer. And it got real tough after a while. We might be at the receiving end of this. Now, that's not going to happen unless we have a disaster in this country, but it could happen. We could wind up in a big social crisis, and there could be some type of fanatical crusade if our country fell apart and people were hungry for a long time. So what we want to do is we want to find somebody to blame. And in this situation, then, all the distresses of society are put on the scapegoats. And the scapegoats are persecuted and killed, and people feel good about killing the scapegoats. Not everybody in Germany was, but the people who were caught up in the Nazi crusade felt good about killing Jews. They were cleansing the land. These people were subhuman, and they deserved to be killed. In Revelation chapter 10, when the church is massacred, it's Revelation chapter 11, remember when the church is massacred, which is the next thing that's going to happen here after this Pentecost, the killing of the 144,000, which is the same as the killing of the 2 witnesses, what do we read, you remember? Those who dwell on the land rejoice over them and make merry and send presents to one another, because these 2 prophets tormented those who dwell on the land. They feel good about killing those. Now, the curious thing is that when this happens, celebrating the death of scapegoats releases cultural power for a while. And I've got down here, new Enochs are built. You remember Enoch was the first city built. Cain went out and built Enoch, and he built it right after he killed Abel. Put yourself in Cain's position. Cain's under pressure. Cain's kind of resented God for a long time, and he hasn't really felt like he likes these family devotions that Adam and Eve and Abel and the other children have. But he's the firstborn. He brings his sacrifice to God, and God rejects it. Whoa! Now pressure is really built up. The various unhappinesses in Cain's life, the fact that he's alienated from what's going on around him, has suddenly reached a crisis point because God has rejected his sacrifice. And God comes to him and says, hey, do right and you'll be okay. Put your trust in me, do right, everything will be fine. But Cain doesn't do it. What does he do? It says he talks to Abel in the field. That's interesting. We're not told what they talked about, just that they talked. And in the process of talking, Cain completely loses it and kills Abel. Now he feels good. All of his tension has gone out of his life because he's found somebody to take the tension. He's beat him up. Now, do you understand this? What happens when the captain kicks the lieutenant? What's the lieutenant do? He kicks the sergeant. And the sergeant kicks the corporal, and the corporal kicks the private kicks the mule. That's the way it happens. Because you got to blame somebody. It's not my fault. It's someone else's fault. The Jews were not going to say, we are oppressed by the Romans because of our sins. The Jews are going to say, we're oppressed by the Romans because of their sins. It's those Christians. The Germans didn't say, we lost World War I because we made a mistake and got involved in this war. They said, we lost World War I and were humiliated because of them. It's their fault. And yes, we had wandered from the old ways, but now we have gone back to the old ways, but they won't do it. So it's their fault. All the sins are put on them because they won't go back to the old ways. And so we kill them and we feel good. Now, this is a counterfeit of something. And when we've killed them and we feel good, we can go out and we have a lot of cultural energy. And so you build your city. That's where all the cities of the ancient world come from. The city of man is always built on the release of energy that comes after a massacre. You scapegoat somebody and all the tension is released out of your life. It's their fault. We hit them. We kill them. We feel good now. Oh, yeah. Now we're relieved from all the pressure and we enter into a Sabbath rest because that's over, and immediately after the Sabbath we go out into the next week and we have cultural power. Now, of course, that's exactly what happens in true religion. All the sins and tension and pressure of the world is put on Jesus. Jesus dies, and on the basis of Jesus' death, we enter into Sabbath. He enters into Sabbath, and so do we, and the New Jerusalem is built on the other side. But it's kind of harder to be a Christian because instead of blaming somebody else and persecuting them and taking away their civil rights and not letting them drink at the same water fountain as you do, I mean, after all, we lost the war between the states because of black people. It's all their fault, so we'll make them pay. They can't drink the same water fountain we do and whatnot. We put blame on them, and if they get out of line, we get a bunch of guys together in white sheets and kill them. Now, there were a lot of people in the South who didn't go along with that, but there were plenty who did. Why? And they would get together and have mass meetings and all feel good, and they go out and lynch some poor nigger and feel good about it afterwards. That didn't happen every day, but it did happen. How did it happen? Same thing. You have a nation that's lost a war, that is punished after the war by Reconstruction. Pressure is there, and some people have an epiphany. It's the nigger's fault. They join a group together, and they do something about it, and they feel good. It's how civilization works. Now, if you're not allowed to put the blame on somebody else and you have to put the blame on yourself, then you have to kill yourself, right? That's what we call mortification. Mortification is killing yourself. Instead of killing somebody else, putting all the blame on him and killing him and instantly feeling good, you kind of have to wrestle day by day killing yourself. Mortification of sin, dying to self. That's not something that happens all at once in a big crisis and you just go out the other side and build your city. That's something that's hard to do, and it takes a long time to do, but gradually the city is built. So Christianity functions the same way, but because we have to kill ourselves and we have to have discipline in the church, it builds much more slowly. But it's the same principle. Our city is built on the cornerstone of the death of Jesus Christ, just as the false cities of the world were built on human sacrifices. Sometimes, quite literally, we read that Jericho was rebuilt by who? Jael? What was his name? At any rate, it says he laid the foundation with the death of his firstborn son. He killed his son, put him as a foundation stone. The city was built on him. That's called a threshold sacrifice. And Cain's death is the foundation of Enoch. Remus's death is the foundation of Rome. Remember, Romulus killed Remus and built Rome. Jesus' death is the foundation of the New Jerusalem. But, see, we're not allowed to get into this scapegoating thing. When there's a crisis of culture and there are distresses and pressure is building up, we're supposed to turn to the Psalms and interact with God. And we're supposed to lay hold of the true Pentecost, which is the coming of the Holy Spirit. And we're supposed to go back to the true old ways, which is the Bible and not some culture myth. That way we don't get involved in fanaticism and crusades. You know, it's kind of interesting that people who are Christians find it much harder to get sucked up into movements than other people do. The more mature you are as a Christian, the more stable you are, the more you tend to be just a little bit nervous about big crusade type things. You go to a Promise Keepers meeting, and there's 10,000 charismatics there and 200 Calvinistic pastors. The charismatics all find it real easy to get into this. The Calvinists are saying, well, I don't know. You know, they kind of get into it, and they're kind of not sure. And some of the songs they feel like getting into, and some of them they don't, right? Because the more mature you are as a Christian, the more the gyroscope inside of you spins faster and faster, and you're more stable. That's the analogy I use. We all have gyroscopes inside ourselves, and the more mature we are, the faster the gyroscope spins, and the more stable you are, the less you are tossed about by every wind of doctrine, and the more difficult it is for you to get sucked up into mass movements. The more mortification you practice on the inside, the more you know of the Scripture, the more difficult it is for you to get sucked up into mass movements. So at this point, we're different. We don't go out on a crusade and kill a bunch of people. We're not supposed to. That's not the way we relieve pressure on ourselves and on our society. But that's the way they do, and that's what's happening here in Revelation chapter 13. The Jews experience a big revival of what they think is their traditional religion, the oral law. That's the problem. We had strayed from it. And a whole bunch of people who'd become Christians undergo this experience. And what do we call those Christians who convert back to the oral law tradition? Judaizers. And Paul talks about him. He says Demas is apostatized. There's a big apostasy that happens that Paul talks about. He says it's happening. It's about to come. The big apostasy. A bunch of people who become Christians and then all of a sudden they say, you know, this was a mistake, and they go back. They're part of this revival of false religion. And then there will be a persecution of those who don't go along with it, which is the massacre of the 2 witnesses or the massacre of the 144,000. But then things don't turn out the way they expect because God acts. One last point, and I'm sorry that I'm running much later than I should, but the last point on page 127. If the scapegoats in this activity turn out to be really innocent, sooner or later their killers feel guilt and become open to the message of the scapegoats. Well, that's why martyrdom leads to conversion. The Christians refuse to go along with what's going on. So the Christians are massacred. But a lot of people begin to think maybe we shouldn't have done this. These people were innocent. Remember what happens in Revelation chapter 11. Those who dwell on the land rejoice over the massacre of the believers, but the people from the tribes and tongues and nations and peoples contemplate their dead bodies for 3.5 days. Don't allow them to be buried, and then we read that a lot of them are converted. Rome had the same revival. When Nero burns Rome, The Romans had a big revival of the old ways, which of course were not old ways at all, but they became Rome. Rome is the answer. Rome this, Rome that. And anybody who wouldn't go along with it was put to death, which meant the Christians were. And Nero blamed the Christians for burning Rome. He started putting them to death. So Christians are martyred. But what happens? Romans see Christians dying. They see that they're innocent. They think about it, and then they're converted. The blood of the martyrs becomes the seed of the church. And that's why, folks, historically, it's only through martyrdom that the church grows. It may be martyrdom in the big sense of being thrown to the lions, or it may be martyrdom in the sense that you practice self-mortification and killing yourself as you mortify sin. But it's only as Christians mortify sin, and frequently it's as Christians are actually put to death, that God brings pressure on the world and brings people to Himself. Well, I'm sorry, our time is way up. We'll probably touch on this again next week, but then we have to move further into other aspects of what's going on here. Take away from here, this is the way history moves. Crisis, big Pentecost, mass movements, scapegoats. That's what happens. And that's what happened here. Let's pray. Father in heaven, we ask that you would spare us from going through this kind of thing in our day. We can see the pieces of the puzzle